A lot of different people have different ideas of what that means. I suppose the simplest way of formulating it is living your life independently in accordance with your own desires, your own wishes, etc. And it's difficult really to define it beyond that, because it ultimately does come down to each man making that decision, deciding how he wants to live his life. But despite the vagueness of the term, and despite the general consensus of what it means, there are conflicts that exist when a man decides to fully commit himself to the so-called 𝗦𝗏𝗴𝗂𝗏, to go in his own way. And today I want to talk about some of those constraints. The real constraints, some of them are very, very heavy in some cases, some less so. But I think it's important to address this because you don't often hear this in the manosphere, in the so-called 𝗦𝗏 community. The first area is one I've been talking about quite a bit recently, and that is the interference of so-called SJW culture, or far-left politics, or just media policing in the area, specifically of video games, but more broadly, media, film, etc. It's becoming increasingly difficult to enjoy things that one would naturally be inclined to enjoy because of political, cultural influences that render products that perhaps 5, certainly 10 years ago you would have enjoyed thoroughly. And let's not talk about how certain franchises were effectively ruined by this politically correct, silly, PC, SJW culture. I'm talking about IPs like Dragon Age, great fantasy world, at least the original one, but everything after the first one turned to shit, and the third one, the final incarnation, was utter shit. It was insane in how many things were quite literally forced down your throat there, not being optional. So yes, there are real cultural constraints to things that typically people enjoy who would classify themselves as 𝗦𝗏𝗏. Not all 𝗦𝗏𝗏, obviously, but many 𝗦𝗏𝗏, including myself, we enjoy video games, computer games, however you want to phrase it, and there are real obstacles there. Never mind film. We all know what happened recently with Marvel. I don't need to go into it, but there's this repeated pattern of broad cultural trends interfering with the things that we like to do and enjoy in our free time. And this has several implications. One implication is it's really hard to be truly apathetic. Now, I know a lot of people who don't know me very well like to think I'm apathetic. I'm not. I wouldn't call myself excessively passionate either, but I do care about certain things. It does bother me that there's real interference in popular culture, because a lot of the things I enjoy have been, if not outright destroyed, severely limited and curtailed by some of these influences, and I would argue not for the better. And whilst that's not a real obstacle to quote-unquote going your own way, it can detract from your quality of life if you enjoy these things. Now, there's another realm of constraint that is quite different from this thing we call the culture war, and I'd argue it's much more personal, it's much more hard-hitting, it's much more intimate, and it can really torment a soul. And I'm talking about the realm of familial relations, the realm of friendship, the areas of life where people typically feel they're closest to the people involved. Particularly in cultures that tend to be more traditional, is the type of pressure that can be exerted on a man who decides to go his own way by family members to cave into certain things, such as marriage, or if somebody expresses the desire not to have children, these sorts of things. I have witnessed this over the years countless times. I've lost count. And I'm certain there are thousands more men out there that are afflicted by this. And this classic scenario is pretty simple. You get a situation where a young man grows up in a more or less traditional household and or culture, usually very religious, usually quite rigid, and he's been exposed to the so-called red pill. And he becomes aware of certain things. He becomes aware of his own utility. He becomes aware of the obstacles in life. He becomes aware of his lack of humanity in the eyes of others. And oftentimes this can lead to red pill rage. But after the embers have cooled down, let's say he gets past that phase, he's faced with some serious opposition. I know many, many men who are in this situation. They tend to be young to youngish, meaning somewhere in their teens to their late 20s, and the family is constantly asking them, when are you going to get married? When are you going to have children? When are you going to do this? And They just want to live their own lives on their own terms. They just want to go their own way. No pun intended. And there's some real questions that arise from this type of quagmire, right? Because just because the family is making certain demands on you doesn't mean they haven't treated you well. Perhaps they were a very loving and caring family. They just have values that don't necessarily intersect with your own values as a man, as an individual who's absorbed 𝗦𝗏𝗃 thought that thinks that this is the best path for him in life. And this is especially true of men going their own way, especially if you grow up in these traditional cultural households. And what do? There's a conflict of interest. The family doesn't approve of your lifestyle, whatever that means, and that means in most cases simply that you don't want to get married or you don't want to have children. Fair enough. But to them it's anathema. To them it's the worst thing they could possibly hear. They want grandchildren. They want to carry on the so-called family legacy. Take your pick. So it's a big deal. And in such a scenario, such a man is left really to make a decision whether or not he caves to his family and possibly loses family support. And you could certainly make an argument there that if the family actually cared about him or loved him, especially the parents, they wouldn't pass judgment on him and would accept his decision regardless. But that's not always the case, and I've known a few men over the years that had to effectively break off contact with the family in order to pursue their own goals in life, to go their own way. But that's not easy and arguably far more impactful than the so-called culture war. The culture war sucks, it ruins the things we enjoy, and it does make going your own way difficult, but these family matters make them even more complicated. And that's really just the icing on the cake. There are even more complex situations that are not as common, but still exist, that interfere at the level of individual psychology with a man's ability to go his own way. For example, I have a very close friend who's 𝗦𝗏𝗃 that for years has struggled with a certain situation involving a family member. Now, it's not that the family member disapproves of him going his own way, but the family member is physically, emotionally, and mentally dependent on him, and to a much lesser extent sometimes financially, and he feels torn. He's at the stage now where, as much as he cares about the person, a lot of things that he does for this person, a lot of the aid rendered to this person on all fronts, is born out of compassion, born out of a sense of obligation. Not entirely voluntary, because there's that familial connection, and my friend does care about the person a great deal, but the family member in question, because of this person's dependency on my friend, interferes with a lot of things that he would like to do. Takes up enormous amounts of time. I think, as I cited before, this family member is very isolated and has immense emotional and mental dependency on this person, and probably, by his estimation, would wither away in some capacity, physically or mentally, without his presence and constant support and constant intervention. So what does he do in a situation like that? He feels personally conflicted on a number of fronts. For example, the question he will pose to me is he really going his own way because of the constant obligation and pressure put on him? Or the fact that if he were to, quote-unquote, abandon this person, even though this family member is well-intentioned in a lot of ways, it would be a bit of an ethical dilemma, right? Because this person is being cast aside. And frankly speaking, I don't have a good answer to this type of situation, and I would be equally torn and equally burdened were I in that situation. And there's no easy answer here. There's no easy way out. It's not that the family member disapproves of him going his own way. It's that the dependencies that exist between him and his family, in this case, are so great that if he were to completely go his own way and essentially disappear into the yonder, for the most part, this family member might cease to exist just because of the mental, emotional, and physical deterioration that would take place. And I only cite this, one, because I think it's demonstrative of how difficult it can be sometimes just to go your own way, whatever that means, and also because there are barriers that exist beyond the obvious, barriers that exist beyond the culture war, barriers that exist even beyond the traditional conservative constraints that I mentioned prior. And I would hazard a guess, and even relationships of friendship can, at times, exert so much pressure that the person, the man who wants to go his own way, cannot properly do so in accordance with his own definition of what that means. The reality of all of this is that it comes down to each individual man to make decisions on how he's going to pursue his goals. And sometimes, unfortunately, going your own way comes at a terrible price. Sometimes it means giving up your family. Sometimes being a moral and ethical person in accordance with your own values means you limit your own ability to go your own way. It's pretty complicated at the end of the day. And if any men in my audience or elsewhere struggle with some of these questions and struggle with some of these obstacles, I want to say that you're definitely not alone. There are many men out there in a similar situation, and I understand. Sometimes it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, and not that the world is against you, but the world just couldn't give a damn. And it's in those situations when it feels worse, especially when you have emotional, physical, and mental dependence, such as the case with my friend and his family member, weighing down on him. And that decision to fully go your own way and not conform to whatever expectations are put upon you, it's complicated and it's difficult, and it's not as easy as just going your own way and doing whatever you want. Because at the end of the day, even as we do go our own way, we're still part of this world. People think I'm apathetic and just don't give a damn. That's not true. I still care about several things in this world quite deeply, and it often saddens me when I look at the state of the world. But I'm also part of this world, and we all are. And we have to navigate the world in the best way we can. And sometimes it's not possible to be indifferent, apathetic, and just bulldoze your way through life just by going your own way, whatever that means. So I just wanted to add a bit of nuance to this discussion of what it means to go your own way. And I haven't laid out any terms or definitions because I don't really know what it means, precisely because of the complexities and complications that can be involved in it. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful, and if I'm still alive, I'll check you out at a later date. As always, may the gods watch over you, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.